The rain arrived the morning they buried Victor Cruz Morales, as if Mexico City itself understood the weight of what had been lost. Valeria stood beneath a black umbrella held by someone whose name she couldn't recall, watching as her father's casket descended into earth that would never truly claim him. Men like Victor didn't disappear into death. They left blueprints, empires, expectations that wrapped around the living like silk and steel. She wore black, as expected. Armani, tailored precisely to her frame. Her natural curls were pulled back into a low chignon, elegant and severe. The mourners who filled the cemetery came in waves, legitimate business associates who knew only half the truth, government officials whose hands her father had greased for decades, and those others, the ones who stood at a careful distance, their respect evident in their silence. Valeria's eyes remained dry. She had cried once, alone in her father's study 3 nights ago, surrounded by his books on logistics and infrastructure, his maps of trade routes that spanned from Veracruz to Vancouver. Once had been enough. Grief was a luxury she could afford in private, but never in public. Her father had taught her that much. Miss Cruz Morales. The attorney approached with practiced deference, a slim leather folder in his hands. When you're ready, there are documents requiring your immediate attention. She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the grave. I'll be at the office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Of course. He hesitated. Your father. He prepared extensively for this transition. Everything you need to know. Tomorrow, she repeated, her voice soft but absolute. He withdrew, and Valeria was left with the rain and the weight of succession. At 38, she had been groomed for this moment her entire life, though neither she nor her father had wanted it to arrive so soon. A heart attack, the doctors said. Swift and merciless. She suspected the truth was more complicated. Victor Cruz Morales had enemies who understood that a bullet would create chaos, but a medical crisis would create opportunity. The opportunity was now hers to seize or squander. As the ceremony concluded, Valeria accepted condolences with grace. She spoke Spanish with the old families, English with the American partners, Portuguese with the Brazilian contingent who had flown in specifically to gauge whether the daughter could hold what the father had built. Her handshakes were firm, her embrace measured, her words precise. He spoke of you often, a silver-haired woman said, someone Valeria recognized from photographs but had never met. He said you had his mind, but your mother's heart. Valeria's mother had died when she was 12. Cancer, slow and certain. She barely remembered what her mother's heart had felt like, but she knew her father's mind intimately. Every spreadsheet, every negotiation, every calculated risk. Thank you, she said, because there was nothing else to say. By the time she returned to her penthouse in Polanco, night had fallen. The apartment was everything her father had taught her to value. Understated luxury, clean lines, art that spoke of culture rather than mere wealth. She poured herself a glass of Hibiki whiskey, Japanese, because her father had believed that the best things came from discipline and patience, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Somewhere below, in offices and warehouses and shipping containers, the machinery of her inheritance hummed. Legitimate businesses, freight forwarding, customs brokerage, logistics consulting. And beneath that, threaded through it like a nervous system, the other operations, the ones that made men wealthy and governments nervous, the ones her father had insisted she understand completely before she turned 30. She had understood. She had excelled. And now, she would lead. Valeria raised her glass to the city lights, to her father's memory, to the intricate web of power she had just inherited. She would not let it unravel, and she would not let lesser men assume she was a transitional figure, a placeholder until someone with more testosterone could claim the throne. She would do something none of them expected. She would expand. The reception hall at the Four Seasons in New York gleamed with the particular kind of elegance that came from old money and new power intersecting. Valeria moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged in every room she entered, her deep brown skin luminous against the champagne silk of her gown. The event was ostensibly about U.S.-Mexico trade relations, a gathering of diplomats, business leaders, and politicians who understood that real power was built in conversations, not conferences. She had come to New York with a specific purpose: to be seen, to be assessed, and to begin reshaping how her father's partners, both legitimate and otherwise, perceived her. 3 months had passed since Victor's death. 3 months of proving she could maintain operations, settle disputes, and keep the revenue flowing north and south across borders that existed on maps but meant little to money. Miss Cruz Morales, a congressman whose name she had memorized, approached with an eager smile. I was hoping to speak with you about your company's expansion into the Pacific Northwest. She listened, nodded at appropriate moments, provided answers that were informative without being revealing. This was the dance she had learned from her father. Give them enough to feel satisfied, never enough to feel certain. It was during this conversation that she first noticed him. He stood near the bar, tall and composed in a way that suggested military bearing softened by years in civilian life. Korean American, she assessed immediately, early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that tracked the room with the same analytical attention she employed. His suit was excellent, Tom Ford probably, but worn with an ease that suggested he cared about quality, not labels. Their eyes met across the space between conversations. The moment extended, neither looking away, a recognition passing between them that had nothing to do with prior acquaintance and everything to do with seeing someone who operated on the same frequency. The congressman was still talking. Valeria offered an apology, excused herself with practiced grace, and found her trajectory naturally curving toward the bar. He watched her approach. No pretense of surprise. No feigned disinterest, just attention, direct and respectful. Daniel Park, he said when she arrived, extending his hand. His voice was measured, the accent American with no particular regional marker. Congressman from Washington State. Valeria Cruz Morales. His hand was warm, his grip firm without being aggressive. I know who you are. His smile was slight, appreciative. Then you have me at a disadvantage. I doubt that. She accepted a glass of white wine from the bartender. Chilean, she noted, always aware of origins. Your committee work on Pacific trade has been comprehensive. You follow congressional committee assignments? There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine curiosity. I follow anything that affects how goods move between countries, Valeria said. Transportation, customs, regulatory frameworks. It's my business to understand the architecture of trade. Cruz Morales Logistics, Daniel said. Your father built something remarkable. I was sorry to hear of his passing. She studied him for calculation, for the particular kind of opportunism that came with approaching the newly bereaved. Instead, she found what looked like sincerity. Thank you. He believed that infrastructure was destiny, that whoever controlled how things moved controlled everything else. A man who understood power. Daniel's eyes held hers. That kind of vision doesn't usually transfer cleanly to the next generation. Are you asking if I'm capable of maintaining what he built? I'm observing that you're here, in New York, at an event designed to showcase stability and continuity. That suggests you're not just maintaining, or you're expanding. Valeria felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she hadn't expected. This man saw her. Not as Victor's daughter, not as a beautiful woman to be charmed, but as someone with her own architecture of ambition. Expansion requires partnerships, she said carefully. The right kind of partnerships. ones built on mutual understanding and aligned interests. And what interests you, Miss Cruz Morales? The question was professional, but something underneath it wasn't. She could feel the current running between them, electric and dangerous in its potential. Efficiency, she said. Elegance. Systems that work because they're designed properly, not because they're forced. You're describing infrastructure. Daniel's voice lowered slightly, intimate despite the crowd around them. Or something else? Perhaps both. They stood there, the conversation having moved beyond networking into something neither had anticipated. Around them, the reception continued its carefully orchestrated dance, but Valeria felt suspended in this particular moment, this unexpected connection. I'm speaking on a panel tomorrow afternoon, Daniel said. Border efficiency and technological integration. Probably too technical to be interesting, but if you're in the city. What time? 2 o'clock. The Council on Foreign Relations. Valeria's smile was genuine this time, not the practiced expression she offered to lesser contacts. I'll be there. Daniel nodded, something in his expression shifting from professional to personal. I hope so. A aide appeared at his shoulder, though whispering urgently about a senator who required his attention. Daniel excused himself with the kind of grace that suggested he'd rather not, and Valeria watched him navigate through the crowd with the same measured composure she recognized in herself. She stayed another 40 minutes, making the connections she'd come to make, but her mind returned repeatedly to the man who had seen her not as a woman to underestimate or a legacy to appropriate, but as an equal with her own vision of power. That night, in her hotel room overlooking Central Park, Valeria researched Daniel Park with the thoroughness she applied to every potential asset. Congressional record. Impressive. Focused on trade and border issues. Background, military academy, private sector experience in logistics before politics. Personal life, unmarried, no scandals. No obvious weaknesses. What struck her most was his voting record on issues affecting cross-border commerce. He was pragmatic where others were ideological, interested in what worked rather than what sounded good. He understood that borders were less walls than membranes, and that smart policy meant managing flow, not stopping it. He understood, in other words, exactly what her father had built his empire on. Valeria closed her laptop and stood at the window, watching the city lights blur in the late spring rain. She had come to New York to project strength and continuity. She hadn't expected to find someone who might understand the full scope of what she was building. Dangerous, she thought. But perhaps necessarily so. She would attend his panel. She would continue the conversation. And she would see if Daniel Park was the kind of man who could hold her full truth when the time came to reveal it. The panel was everything Daniel had promised: technical, precise, and utterly absorbing for anyone who understood that policy was just power dressed in procedure. Valeria sat in the third row, notebook open but largely ignored, watching him articulate a vision of border management that was simultaneously practical and revolutionary. The question isn't whether goods cross borders, Daniel said in response to a question about enforcement. They always have. They always will. The question is whether we create systems that channel that flow intelligently, or systems that simply push it into shadows. Shadows make everyone less safe and less prosperous. She felt a thrill at his precision. He was speaking about legitimate trade, but the logic applied to everything her father had built. Create the channel, control the flow, make it so efficient that deviation became more expensive than compliance. When the panel concluded, Valeria approached the stage. Daniel saw her immediately, excused himself from a cluster of policy wonks, and met her at the edge of the room. "You came," he said. "You were persuasive." "About border policy?" "About understanding how systems actually work." She tilted her head slightly. "Most politicians talk about borders as if they're walls. You talk about them as if they're doors." Doors can be locked when necessary and opened when beneficial, Daniel said. Walls are just expensive ways to feel secure without being safer. They stood close enough that Valeria could smell his cologne, subtle, probably custom blended. Everything about him suggested someone who paid attention to details without being showy about it. "Have you eaten?" he asked. "Not since breakfast." "I know a place. Quiet, good food. No one who'll interrupt with policy questions." Valeria considered the invitation. She had other meetings scheduled, other contacts to cultivate. But something about Daniel Park made her want to deviate from her careful plans. "Lead the way, Congressman." The restaurant was Korean, tucked into a side street in Midtown, the kind of place that thrived on return customers rather than reviews. Daniel was clearly known here. The owner greeted him warmly, led them to a private corner table without being asked. "You come here often?" Valeria asked as they settled into their seats. "When I need to think. The food is excellent. And Mrs. Kim doesn't care about politics." They ordered, Daniel guiding her through the menu with the ease of someone who knew it intimately, and settled into a conversation that started with policy and drifted into philosophy. "Your father," Daniel said, pouring them both tea. "He must have taught you young that systems matter more than individual actions." "He did. He said that people who focused on transactions were dealers. People who built systems were architects." "And you wanted to be an architect?" "I wanted to be excellent at whatever I chose." Valeria met his eyes. Architecture seemed more permanent than dealing. Daniel smiled. "And here you are, running an organization that spans 2 countries, probably more." "Here I am," she agreed, "though running makes it sound simpler than it is. Inheritance comes with expectations. Legacy is a weight." "Do you feel weighed down?" The question was gentle, personal in a way that should have raised her defenses. Instead, Valeria found herself being honest. "Sometimes. Other times I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Like everything before was preparation." "I know that feeling." Daniel's expression shifted, something vulnerable appearing beneath his composure. "I spent 20 years preparing for public service, military academy, private sector, building credentials, but the actual work, representing people, shaping policy, it's both exactly what I expected and nothing like what I imagined. Because theory and practice are different. Because power looks different when you're holding it." Valeria felt her heart rate increase. This was dangerous territory, this honesty. But it was also intoxicating, being with someone who understood the gravity of responsibility without flinching from it. The food arrived, banchan filling the table with small plates of complexity and balance. They ate, talked, found themselves laughing at a story Daniel told about his first congressional fundraiser, where he'd accidentally insulted a major donor by being too honest about policy. "You survived?" Valeria asked. "Barely. My staff wanted to fire me, but the donor appreciated the honesty. Sent a larger check the next week with a note. Finally, someone who doesn't lie to my face. Honesty is rare in your world. In yours too, I imagine." Valeria's smile turned enigmatic. "Everything is performance. The question is whether the performance serves a purpose or just maintains appearances." "And your performance?" Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What purpose does it serve?" "Survival. Growth. Proving that what my father built wasn't dependent on him being a man." "You've faced resistance." "Constantly. Men who think a woman, especially a woman who doesn't look like their daughters, can't possibly understand the complexity of international logistics." She said it without anger, just observation. "They test me. I exceed their tests. They recalibrate. We continue." Daniel's eyes had darkened with something that looked like anger on her behalf. "Their limitation, not yours." I've never let anyone else's limitations define my ceiling. I can see that. The conversation shifted, flowed. He covered everything from Korean cinema to Mexican muralists to the philosophy of Octavio Paz. Valeria found herself surprised by the breadth of Daniel's knowledge, by his comfort with silence, by the way he listened as intently as he spoke. It was nearly midnight when they finally left the restaurant. The New York night was warm, humid, with the promise of summer. Daniel walked her toward the street where her car waited. "I'm in Washington most of the time," he said as they approached the vehicle. "But I'm in New York and Mexico City regularly. Trade committee work. Then we'll likely see each other again." "I'd like that." He paused, then added, "Not for committee work." Valeria felt the electricity between them intensify. What for then? To continue this conversation, to see where it leads. She should be careful. She should maintain distance. She should remember that men in positions of power were useful contacts but dangerous attachments. But looking at Daniel Park, at his steady gaze, his careful restraint, his evident desire held in check by respect, she found herself wanting something she rarely allowed herself: connection, real connection. "I'd like that too," she said quietly. Daniel smiled, and for a moment they stood there, the city moving around them, something building between them that felt both inevitable and impossible. He didn't try to kiss her, didn't push for more, just held her gaze and said, "Travel safely, Valeria." Her name in his mouth sounded like a promise. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened through a careful exchange of messages and strategically timed meetings. Daniel came to Mexico City for a trade summit. Valeria ensured she was at the reception. She traveled to Washington for meetings with customs officials. Daniel suggested dinner at a restaurant where they could talk without being observed by too many interested eyes. They were careful. Both understood the optics of a congressman becoming involved with a logistics magnate, especially one whose business straddled multiple regulatory frameworks. But they were also increasingly unable to resist the pull between them. It was during a quiet evening in Mexico City, in Valeria's penthouse after a particularly successful negotiation she'd concluded with American shipping interests, that their relationship shifted from possibility to certainty. Daniel had come at her invitation, ostensibly to discuss a policy paper he was developing on North American economic integration. They'd started with work, genuinely, both too disciplined to pretend interest they didn't feel, but as the evening progressed, as they moved from her office to her living room, as the city lights spread below them like a constellation of opportunity, the conversation became personal. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. He sat on her sofa, jacket removed, tie loosened, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Always. What do you want? Not for your business, not for your father's legacy, for yourself." Valeria was silent for a long moment, considering the question no one else had thought to ask. "To build something that lasts beyond me, to prove that power and principle aren't mutually exclusive. It's to find someone who understands both. Have you? Found someone?" He nodded. Valeria crossed to where he sat, her champagne silk robe moving around her like water. She'd changed from her business attire, allowed herself the comfort of home. Daniel's eyes tracked her movement but with appreciation rather than hunger, though she could see the hunger beneath, carefully restrained. "I think I might have," she said softly. Daniel stood, and suddenly they were close, breathing the same air, feeling the same pull. His hand came up to her face, fingers gentle against her cheek. "I need you to know," he said, voice low, "that I see you, Valeria. Not just the beautiful woman or the powerful executive. I see the mind that built this, the discipline that maintains it, the vision that's expanding it. I see all of you." Her breath caught. And to be seen, truly seen, was a gift she hadn't expected. "And what you see?" she asked. "Someone I could build something with. Something beyond business or politics or any single thing. A partnership. The word resonated through her. Partnership. Not romance that burned hot and fast, but something structural, something designed. I've never been interested in relationships that were just feeling, Valeria said. Feeling fades, structure lasts. Structure built on genuine feeling lasts longest. She smiled. You've thought about this. I've thought about little else since I met you. Daniel kissed her then, and it was everything it should be. Slow and deliberate, tasting of intention and restraint breaking. Valeria responded, her hands finding the solid warmth of his shoulders, feeling the careful control in how he touched her. Nothing rushed, nothing assumed. Just the steady building of something that felt both new and inevitable. They kissed until breathing became difficult, until the wanting was almost unbearable. Then Daniel pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. I should go, he said, though his body contradicted the words. Should you? If I stay, I won't want to leave, and I want... He paused, choosing words carefully. I want to do this right. Not rush. Build it properly. Valeria felt a surge of respect for his restraint, even as her body protested. But he was right. They had time. They would build this the way they built everything else, with intention and care. Then go, she said, kissing him once more. But come back. I will. Always. After he left, Valeria stood at her windows, touching her lips where he'd kissed her, feeling the foundation of something magnificent beginning to form. She had never believed in love that wasn't also partnership, in romance that wasn't also strategy. Daniel Park understood that. He wanted her for everything she was, not despite what she was. She could work with that. She could build with that. She could love with that. Their relationship developed with the same careful precision they both brought to their work. Daniel visited Mexico City monthly, officially for committee business, but increasingly to see Valeria. She traveled to Washington, ostensibly for meetings with various agencies, but really to be in the same city as him. They were discreet. Neither wanted their personal relationship scrutinized before it was solid enough to withstand pressure, but among those who mattered, among the people in both their orbits who understood power, it became known that Congressman Park and Valeria Cruz Morales were building something together. You're different, her attorney observed during a meeting about expanding operations into the Pacific Northwest, Daniel's home territory, though that was never explicitly stated as the reason for the expansion. Happier. Valeria didn't deny it. I've found someone who understands that ambition isn't a flaw. And he understands everything? The question hung between them, weighted with implication. Her attorney knew what her father had built, knew the layers beneath the legitimate operations. He was asking if Daniel knew. He understands enough, Valeria said carefully, and when the time comes to understand more, I'll know whether he can hold that truth. It was a gamble, on the largest she'd taken since inheriting her father's empire. But Daniel had proven himself in smaller ways. His discretion about their relationship, his questions that suggested he saw more than she'd explicitly revealed, his comfort with moral complexity. They spent a weekend together in Vancouver, a city neutral to both their operations. Daniel had meetings about Pacific trade. Valeria was expanding Cruz Morales Logistics' Canadian footprint. But mostly, they were together, away from the watchful eyes of their respective worlds. They walked the seawall, talked about everything and nothing, made love in a hotel room overlooking the harbor with a tenderness and intensity that surprised them both. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Valeria's head on his chest, Daniel said something that changed everything. I'm going to run for Senate next year. Valeria lifted her head to look at him. The Washington seat? Yes, it's opening up. The party wants me to run. I'd win. The polling is clear. That's a significant step. It is. More visibility, more influence, more scrutiny. He paused. I need you to know what that means for us. Anything about you, about your business, about your father. It will be examined. Valeria's pulse quickened. Here was the moment of truth, earlier than she'd anticipated, but perhaps inevitably. And if that examination reveals things you're not comfortable with? Daniel was quiet for a long time, his hand tracing patterns on her shoulder. When he spoke, his voice was measured. Your father built something remarkable, not just a business, but an infrastructure that serves multiple purposes. I'm not naive, Valeria. I understand that logistics companies don't generate the kind of influence yours has without understanding every aspect of what crosses borders. That's a diplomatic way of saying you suspect I'm more than a freight forwarder. I'm saying I understand that power operates on multiple levels, that legitimate enterprise and other interests can coexist if managed properly. Valeria's heart was racing now. And you're comfortable with that? Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I'm comfortable with you. With your intelligence, your ethics, your vision of what power should accomplish. The specifics? He shrugged. I assume there are things I don't need to know, things that are better kept separate from my work. But the woman I'm falling in love with? Her I know completely. Falling in love. The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any policy proposal or business plan. I don't love easily, Valeria said quietly. I've never trusted anyone with everything I am. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking for what you're willing to give, and offering the same in return. She kissed him then, deep and grateful, feeling something in her chest unlock. This was what partnership meant, not knowing every detail but trusting the person beneath the details, not requiring full transparency, but maintaining full respect. I'm falling in love with you too, she said against his mouth. With the man who sees power as responsibility, who understands that systems matter more than gestures, who believes we can build something that lasts. We can, Daniel said with certainty. We will. They made love again, slower this time, savoring each touch, each breath, each moment of connection. And when Valeria finally fell asleep in his arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. Hope. Not just for her business or her legacy, but for her life. Daniel's Senate campaign launched in the fall with the kind of polish that came from years of careful reputation building. Valeria attended the announcement event in Seattle. Standing in the audience rather than on the platform, they'd agreed that her visible support should come later, once his candidacy was established. But she watched him speak about infrastructure, about trade, about building bridges between countries and communities, and felt pride swell in her chest. This was a man who could change things, who had the vision and discipline to actually implement the ideas that most politicians just talked about. After the event in his Seattle apartment overlooking Elliott Bay, they celebrated privately. Senator Park, Valeria said, handing him a glass of champagne. It has a ring to it. Congressman Park was sufficient for my ego, Daniel said, smiling, but I won't pretend the Senate doesn't offer more opportunity. 4. Everything we've talked about. North American integration, smarter border policy, infrastructure investment that actually works. He paused. For us. Valeria set down her glass. How so? Daniel crossed to where she stood, took her hands in his. A senator has more latitude in who he associates with publicly. A senator's wife would be expected to have her own interests, her own business concerns. The word wife echoed through her mind. Daniel, I know it's fast, he said quickly. I know we've only been together 8 months, but I've never been more certain of anything. You are exactly who I want as my partner, in every sense of that word. Valeria felt tears prick her eyes, a rare occurrence. You want to marry me. I want to build a life with you. A family, eventually, if you want that. But more than that, I want to create something together that's bigger than either of us alone. I think we could change the entire architecture of how North America works, not just economically, but politically, structurally. She heard what he wasn't saying, that her networks, her understanding of how things actually moved, combined with his political power, could reshape continents. It was ambitious to the point of audacity. It was exactly what she wanted. "And my business?" she asked carefully. "The parts you don't ask about?" "Would remain yours to manage. I trust your judgment, Valeria. I trust that whatever you've built with the same intelligence and ethics you bring to everything else." It was the answer she needed. Not ignorance, but trust. Not approval, but respect. "Yes," she said simply. Daniel's face transformed with joy. "Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build this life with you. Yes to all of it." He kissed her, lifting her off her feet, both of them laughing with the sheer relief and happiness of the decision. When he set her down, he pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple, elegant, a single perfect diamond that caught the light like a promise. "I hoped you'd say yes," he admitted, sliding it onto her finger. "You were that certain? I was that hopeful." They spent the night planning, dreaming, sketching out a future that felt both impossible and inevitable. They would marry quietly, before the campaign gained full momentum. They would be strategic about how they integrated their lives publicly. Valeria would maintain her base in Mexico City. Daniel would keep his in Washington. They would be partners in the truest sense, separate enough to maintain their individual power, connected enough to amplify each other. "My father would have liked you," Valeria said as dawn approached. They were tangled together in Daniel's bed, talking in the intimate darkness. He would have recognized someone who understood that power is about architecture, not force. "I wish I could have known him." "You know me. That's enough." Daniel pulled her closer. "This is going to be extraordinary what we build together." "I know. People will underestimate us. They always do, and will exceed their imagination every time." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "God, I love you." "I love you too," Valeria said, and meant it with every carefully guarded piece of her heart. They married in January at the Mexico City courthouse, with only a handful of witnesses present. Valeria wore white, custom-made, elegant without being ostentatious. Daniel wore a dark suit that matched the seriousness of the commitment they were making. The ceremony was brief, the words simple, but the weight of what they were joining was immense. When the official pronounced them married, when Daniel kissed her in front of their small audience, Valeria felt something slot into place in her universe. Partnership. Finally, completely, partnership. The wedding reception was held at her penthouse, a carefully curated gathering of people from both their worlds. Valeria's attorney, her key business contacts, a few family members who had supported her after her father's death. Daniel's closest advisors, a senator who'd mentored him, his parents who had flown in from Los Angeles and looked at Valeria with a mix of welcome and wariness. She charmed them, as she charmed everyone, but she also sensed their questions. Who was this woman their son had chosen? What did she really do? Could she be trusted with their brilliant boy's future? Daniel's mother approached her late in the evening when most guests had departed. She was a small woman, elegant in the way of people who had built their own success, and her eyes were sharp with protective love. "My son says you make him better," she said without preamble. "He makes me better too," Valeria replied honestly. "I hope that's true. Because Daniel, he has the potential to do great things, to change things, and he'll need a partner who strengthens that, not someone who uses him." Valeria met her eyes steadily. "Mrs. Park, I don't need to use your son. I have my own power, my own vision. What I need is someone who can match me, who can build something alongside me that neither of us could create alone. Daniel is that person." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You remind me of myself when I was your age, ambitious, unafraid, willing to fight for what you want. Then you understand why your son chose me." "I'm beginning to." She smiled slightly. "Take care of each other. That's all any mother wants." "We will." After she left, Daniel found Valeria on the terrace, looking out over the city that was her kingdom. "My mother approves," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "That was the test. I thought winning you was the test. That was the easy part. You're extraordinary. Of course I fell in love with you. But my mother's blessing? That's harder to earn." Valeria leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the warmth of his presence. "Your parents seem like good people." "They are. They built something from nothing, came to America with almost no resources and created a life. They understand what it takes to succeed when the system isn't designed for you. You, like me, exactly like us." Daniel kissed her temple. "We're going to do something remarkable, aren't we?" "We already are." They stood there as the night deepened, holding each other, looking out at the city that was just the beginning of what they would claim together. Valeria thought about her father, about the empire he'd built, and the one she was expanding. She thought about Daniel's political ambitions, about the Senate seat he would almost certainly win, about the power that would come with that position. Together, they could reshape borders. Together, they could determine how things moved and who benefited. Together, they could build something that would last decades, generations. It was intoxicating. It was dangerous. Yeah, and it was exactly what she wanted. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said quietly. "About the campaign." "What?" "There are people asking questions. About your business, about your father's connections. Nothing concrete, just curiosity. My advisors say it's normal, that any candidate's spouse gets vetted." Valeria's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "And what do your advisors suggest?" "Transparency where possible. Clear separation between your business and my political work. Maybe bringing in outside auditors to review your company's practices, just to get ahead of any potential concerns." She turned in his arms to face him. "You're asking me to open my books." "I'm suggesting we protect both of us. If there's nothing problematic, an audit proves that. If there are areas of concern, we address them before they become weapons." Valeria understood the logic. She also understood that any serious audit would reveal layers of operation that couldn't survive scrutiny. Not the core illegitimate business. That was too well hidden, too carefully separated. But the edges, the gray areas where legitimate commerce shaded into something less clear. "Let me think about it," she said. "Of course." Daniel's expression was open, trusting. "I'm not trying to control your business. I just want to make sure we're protected." "I know, and you're right to think strategically." She kissed him softly. "Give me a week. I'll talk to my people, figure out what makes sense. That's all I ask." They went back inside to their wedding guests, to the celebration of their union, but Valeria's mind was already working through scenarios. An audit could work if she restructured certain operations, if she moved some activities further into the shadows, if she created enough legitimate business to overwhelm any investigative attention. It would be delicate. It would require trust in people she'd inherited from her father. But it was manageable. Everything was manageable when you understood architecture. In the weeks following their wedding, Valeria threw herself into restructuring her operations with the same intensity she'd brought to building them. She met with her core team, the people who had served her father and now served her, and laid out the new reality. "Daniel is going to be a U.S. Senator," she said in her office. The door closed, the windows showing Mexico City sprawling beneath them. That brings scrutiny. And we need to be cleaner than clean where anyone might look. Her attorney nodded. I've been anticipating this. We can move certain operations entirely offshore, create more distance between the legitimate businesses and the other interests. Do it. I want everything separated so cleanly that even a dedicated investigation finds nothing but boring logistics and freight forwarding. And the less boring parts? This from her operations director, a man who had worked with her father for 20 years. Continue, but with additional layers, additional precautions, no connection that can be traced back to Cruz Morales Logistics or to me personally. They discussed details, timelines, risks. It would take months to implement fully, but Valeria was confident. Her father had taught her to build systems that could withstand pressure. She just needed to reinforce those systems for a new kind of attention. Daniel, meanwhile, was building his campaign. He visited Valeria in Mexico City when he could, and she traveled to Washington to support him. They were photographed together at events, interviewed as a power couple, asked about how they balance their ambitious careers. We see ourselves as partners, Daniel said in an interview with a Washington Post reporter. Valeria has her expertise in international commerce. I have mine in policy. We support each other's work while maintaining independence. And you're not concerned about potential conflicts of interest? The reporter asked. Your wife's business could benefit from the policies you advocate. Daniel's smile was steady. My policies are designed to benefit efficient, ethical businesses across the board. And if Cruz Morales Logistics benefits, it's because they're good at what they do, not because of our marriage. Valeria, watching the interview later, felt pride and worry in equal measure. Daniel was skilled at deflection, at sounding reasonable while revealing little. But eventually, someone would dig deeper. Eventually, the questions would become more pointed. She needed to be ready. On a February evening with Daniel in Washington and Valeria in Mexico City, they had a video call that changed the direction of everything they were building. I've been thinking, Daniel said, his face on her screen looking tired but energized, about what we could actually accomplish together. We've talked about this, Valeria said. She was in her study, documents from her restructuring spread across her desk. North American integration, smarter border policy. Bigger than that. Daniel leaned forward. What if we approached this not as separate interests that sometimes align, but as a genuine partnership? Your infrastructure and my policy making working together intentionally? Valeria felt her pulse quicken. You're talking about coordination. I'm talking about revolution. Reimagining how North America functions economically, using your understanding of how things actually move, and my ability to shape the legal frameworks. It was exactly what she'd dreamed of. Power and policy converging, her father's empire legitimized and expanded through political protection. But it was also dangerous, the kind of explicit coordination that could destroy both of them if revealed. That's a significant step, she said carefully. I know. But think about it, Valeria. Like we could reduce border friction while increasing security. We could make legal commerce so efficient that illegal activity becomes economically irrational. We could reshape an entire continent's economy, while benefiting our respective interests. While benefiting everyone's interests, Daniel countered. Better trade benefits everyone. The fact that we personally benefit is just alignment. Valeria was quiet, thinking through implications. If they did this, if they really built something together that was both legitimate transformation and personal empire building, they would need absolute trust, absolute coordination, absolute security. We'd need to be careful, she said finally. Nothing in writing, nothing that could be traced or proven. Agreed. But we think together anyway. We already finish each other's sentences. Why not finish each other's visions? She smiled at that, feeling the pull of his ambition matching hers. When you're elected. When I'm elected, he agreed, confident in his polling numbers. We start building immediately. Your operations expand in ways that serve broader integration. My policies create the frameworks that make that expansion not just legal, but celebrated. And if someone realizes we're coordinating, then we're a married couple who share similar views on trade policy. Hardly scandalous. Valeria laughed, but she also felt the weight of what they were contemplating. This was the marriage in full, not just love and partnership, but genuine alliance, the kind of power consolidation that could reshape nations. All right, she said, let's build something extraordinary. Daniel's smile filled the screen. I love you. I love you too. Now tell me about the Pacific Corridor proposal. I have thoughts. They spent the next 2 hours discussing policy and logistics, weaving together their separate expertise into something unified. By the time they finished, Valeria felt like they'd just designed the blueprint for their future. She looked at her wedding ring, at the diamond that caught the light from her desk lamp, and thought about promises. She'd promised to love Daniel, to build a life with him. But more than that, she'd promised to meet him as an equal, to bring her full self, ambition, power, vision, to their partnership. She was keeping that promise. Whatever came next, whatever investigations or scrutiny or challenges they faced, they would face them together, as partners, as architects of something unprecedented. And the thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like destiny. Spring arrived in Washington with the cherry blossoms and the final confirmation of what everyone had known for months. Daniel Park would be Washington State's next junior senator. The election was a landslide, his message of practical policy and economic integration resonating across party lines. Valeria attended his victory speech in Seattle, standing just off stage where cameras could catch her, but she wasn't the focus. She watched her husband. The words still felt new, precious, address thousands of supporters, his voice carrying across the crowd with the confidence of someone who had earned this moment. We're going to build bridges, he said, not just between parties, but between countries. Between the commerce that feeds our families and the policies that protect our future. Between what America is and what America could be. The crowd roared, and Valeria felt tears on her cheeks. Pride, yes, but also something more complex. She was watching the man she loved claim power that would intersect with hers in ways few people could imagine. They were about to become one of the most influential partnerships in North America, whether anyone realized it or not. After the speech, after the celebrations, they returned to their hotel room in the early hours of morning. Daniel was still energized, pacing, talking through everything that would come next. The swearing in is in January, he said. We should have a proper wedding celebration then. Something public. Something that establishes us as a partnership. We're already married, Valeria pointed out, but she was smiling. We're legally married. I want everyone to see what we are together. She crossed to him, put her hands on his chest to still his pacing. What are we together? Daniel's eyes met hers, serious and full of love. Everything. We're everything together. He kissed her, and for a moment Valeria let herself just feel the love, the desire, the perfect alignment of their ambitions. Then she pulled back, her mind already returning to the structures they would need to build. I've finished the restructuring, she said. Everything is separated, layered, protected. When you're sworn in, when the scrutiny intensifies, there won't be anything to find except a successful international logistics company. And the other operations? Offshore, distant, impossible to trace back to Cruz Morales or to me. My father built his empire to survive exactly this kind of attention. Daniel nodded. Good. Because what we're going to build, it needs to be unassailable. They talked into the dawn, planning, dreaming, sketching out a future where policy and practice converged to create something unprecedented. A North American economic zone that functioned with the efficiency of her father's smuggling networks, but the legitimacy of Daniel's political vision. Trade that flowed like water. Borders that existed on paper but barely in practice, and at the center of it all, them, Valeria Cruz Morales Park and Senator Daniel Park, the power couple no one saw coming. Meet as the sun rose over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Valeria stood at the window of their hotel room and allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. She had inherited an empire. She had found a partner. She had positioned herself to expand both beyond anything her father could have imagined. The future stretched before her like a highway she would build herself, with Daniel beside her, their combined power reshaping the very architecture of North America. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, coming to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "That we're standing at the threshold of something extraordinary." "Nervous?" "Never." She turned in his arms, her smile confident. "We're too good at this to be nervous." He laughed, kissed her forehead. "Ambitious woman. You love that about me. I love everything about you." They stood together as the city awakened below them, as the future they would claim together came into focus. Valeria thought about her father, about legacy and power and the careful construction of empires. He had built his with patience and precision. She would build hers the same way, but bigger, bolder, backed by political power that could reshape laws to suit her architecture. It would take time. It would take care. It would take the kind of partnership she'd found with Daniel, built on love, yes, but also on mutual ambition and absolute trust. She was ready. They were ready. The threshold awaited, and beyond it, the future they would build together. Whatever that future held, triumph or tragedy, power consolidated or dreams shattered, Valeria Cruz Morales Park knew one thing with absolute certainty. She loved a man who would change North America, and together, they would change it all.